Good to have you with us. This will be our last class. Of course, there will be others. In fact, there's Betty. She's in charge of our Acts classes. Glad to have her with us. And she, I guess, the brochures are printed, and you can get it online too if you're interested. As well, Jim was telling me just before that all the basic the lectures that we've been working on are up online, and there's 3, and he's working on 4. Yes, last week was 5, and this week will be 6. So as we romp through the Old Testament, specifically looking at the book of Exodus, and understanding the world of the Bible, specifically the cultural context. Again, it's a ongoing study, understand, and it takes a lot of work. I mean, seminary, go to 4 years of Bible college and 3 years of seminary and then 3 years of PhD. I got 10, 15, 11, 12 years of school, and I could have been a medical doctor, made a whole lot more money. Maybe, I don't know, been more in debt probably. But yeah, like I said, I've been at it for over 35 years, and I feel like I'm just now beginning to be able to understand. You say, wow, how do you expect me to read the Bible? Well, there are a lot of good tools out there, keep in mind. And of course, as we may mention from our very first class, from Genesis to the book of Revelation, you've undergone thousands of years of history, a lot of cultural changes. And certainly the New Testament is not written like the Old Testament. So it's, homework is what it's called. Homework. I think I told you I had a letter from Kenneth Kitchen, who I'm presenting tonight in relationship to a lot of his materials. I wrote him a letter years ago and thanked him for a good book review of one of these liberal that were tearing down the Word of God, and he wrote me back a very fine letter. And he challenged me. He said, well, if the Bible's true, then the evidence is there. You just got to go look for it. And he said that was the problem with a lot of evangelicals. He says they don't want to do their homework. So I highlighted that in yellow, and I have it framed, and I have it sitting in my office. And I pulled that letter out. He remembered me. I mean, he has one of those minds. I met him a year later, and I said, hi, I'm Dan Warner. He said, hey, Dan, thanks for that letter. That type of brain, I wish I had, but. Anyway, so it's the Bible is a unique text. It's inexhaustible, and it's an ongoing life study, and that's the way it was meant to be. So it stands out unique compared to anything else in the ancient world. There's just nothing else like it, and don't let anybody belittle the Bible. It's just impossible. No one could ever have written anything that we have in our biblical text today. It's just amazing. So we want to finish up tonight looking at in the wilderness, and we were looking specifically at we looked at the Exodus, the people coming out. But anyway, we're dealing with the last half of the middle part of the book of Exodus, which takes us into the wilderness. And we looked last week at God taking them to Mount Sinai, and we tried to at least show you some ideas of what the possibilities are and what the significance is of mountain theology. God, I told you, in the Garden of Eden had a mountain, and then even in the book of Revelation, God returns to that Mount Zion. Mountain is very significant in the ancient world. But what this introduces us to is the idea that God is communicating with man. Remember, they live in a world that all the other cultures had no direct revelation from their God. You understand the word revelation is the word apocalypse. It means to reveal that which was hidden or unknown. All right, so that's the book of Revelation. In Deuteronomy 29:29, you got a great verse that talks about the secret things belong to God unless He reveals them to us. We wouldn't know anything if God didn't reveal it to us. One of the questions I asked my students at Liberty University is this, on their discussion they have to interact with, and it was this week that they had to interact with this question. How important is it for God to reveal? What are the different methods that God has revealed Himself in the Old Testament? What's significant about the phrase, thus saith the Lord? And of course, it's always interesting to read the response, but by and large, they did a very good job. And this is all based upon a book by a fellow by the name of John Walton. I think I mentioned his work to you before, where he has a very significant book out on parallels relating to the Old Testament, kind of what I'm doing in this class here, but from the literary standpoint, going from all the different types of text found in the Bible. And of course, that takes us back to the first lecture. I talked about all the different genres even within the text. And here we have, when we get to the wilderness, we have an itinerary where we have a list of ideas of our cities where the Israelites traveled. This is also true in the ancient world as well, specifically coming out of Egypt. And of course, we're looking tonight, specifically as we look at the Ark of the Covenant and some of the artifacts within the Ark of the Covenant. All of those ideas, too, even the encampment that we have, that I'm showing you here, and I'll show you in a moment, basically have remnants of where the Israelites were, and that was in the land of Egypt. And so understanding the cultural context is like I said, an ongoing process, and it takes a lot of work. It's not just picking up your English translation and saying, wow, I fully understand to a certain extent. Certainly there are many places, obviously there are, the translators in most cases have done a very excellent job in trying to communicate what the original text mean. But again, there's nothing like knowing the original text. So they do offer every once in a while here in Acts classes, introductory Hebrew classes and introductory Greek classes. And so if you're not doing, I would take that challenge on. And besides that, there's a lot of them online. It's just it's a unique world because even in our English translations, as I was telling you about, there's not in most cases a word for word literal translation. One Hebrew word sometimes takes 5 words in English to translate. So it's just a rewarding study to know the languages and to know the cultural backdrop of what is transpiring in the biblical world. And it just really, things just start to pop when you start looking at these ideas, and then you study this one idea and then you see it again later on as it's mentioned in other books of the Bible, and then as the theme is carried throughout the whole Old Testament and into the New Testament. It just points very clearly that we have an author that was able to write and communicate accurately and preserve his word accurately so that we can today understand what God was communicating to us, what he was revealing. And of course, revelation is significant, is it not? Obviously, because without God revealing to us, we'd have no idea of what salvation is all about, what God expects of us, and the list goes on, as you know very well. But the ancient world, they had no direct communication with their gods. Their gods didn't speak to them. And as we'll get to tonight, and maybe we'll just jump there right now, we'll come back to this idea, but as we're talking about it, I have to go back to my other slide. Here are the gods of Egypt that I'm sure Moses knew very well. A huge pantheon of gods. A god for everything. They were very animistic in the ancient world, were they not? There was a god for the river, Osiris. There was a god for the sun. You know him as Ra, sun god. And there was a god for the netherworlds, Anubis. There was a god for this, everything. But those gods didn't speak to the people. They never heard anything from their gods. And so this sets Israel, the Jewish faith, apart from everybody else, is that their God spoke to them and gave them a body of literature that they could follow and lay down principles, rules, and regulations, obviously, as well as historical facts of their ancestors and so on, that they could refer back to. There's nothing else like it in the ancient world. Certainly there's a lot of parallels that we've been talking about, but that's all they are, is parallels. Remember, they're parallel lines, and parallel lines never meet. They never cross. They're just parallels. Anyway, these are the gods that I'm sure Moses knew very well as he comes on, I believe, in the 15th century. And you see him all the time, of course, in the reliefs for the pharaohs and in tombs, as they were very much concerned, obviously, if you know your Egyptian theology, for the afterlife. And so on. But of course the dominant god was Ra, the sun god, and there he is in the middle with the sun disk over his head, and then a host of other deities specifically for different functions within their lives. And that's basically how they identified gods, was what function did they do. River god, sun god, fertility god. Obviously, we have a number of them mentioned in the Bible, like Baal was the storm god, also a god of fertility. Asherah poles, and Ben-Hadad, another god. There's Moloch and Chemosh, all these gods mentioned in the Old Testament. And of course, what is really sad about the whole situation is Israel got sucked up into all of these different cults to a certain extent. And by and large, God had to send the prophets to them. And thus saith the Lord, what are you doing? Why are you assimilating with these people? And so it was an ongoing process. But anyway, the world of Egypt is a fascinating world. And of course, same thing with Mesopotamia and also in Greece. You know all the gods from Greece, Zeus and Hera, and the list goes on. But it's certainly a fascinating world. But this was the culture that Moses was immersed in. And the Israelites were there for 400 years. And it's amazing that they didn't completely assimilate into the Egyptian culture. For 400 years, that's a long time. So nonetheless, quite amazing in relationship to what you see. So the ancient gods didn't speak. And God says, I'm going to speak. In fact, I want to be next to you. I want to be next to you. And I'm going to create a place for my dwelling, and it's called the tabernacle. The tabernacle. So as Israel's in the wilderness, of course, they set up camp. One of the things I've been trying to illustrate very clearly is the settings for these stories that take place. The reason why is because in the scholarship field, and maybe you've come across it, maybe you've been in school, where most professors that are not Christians say, what you see in the Bible is nothing but myths and legends. It could never have been written in the time period that you say it is. Most of it was written during the Intertestament period after the Greeks came through. They got a lot of their ideas from the Greeks, and therefore they began to develop and formate their canon of scriptures. Well, what is interesting about the stories in the Old Testament, because of their literary style and the descriptive elements within them, you have to say, well, is this really true? Was most of these written during the Intertestament period? Or were they even written in later periods, as what is recorded in the Bible? Moses comes out of Egypt, we believe, in the 14th century. So therefore, the things that he wrote, specifically the Pentateuch, you would expect them to reflect ideas from that time period, would you not? Not somewhere in the Greek period, because Moses had no contact with the Greeks. Well, he could have, but that's a different story. What is interesting is the encampment as they came into the wilderness, and that's what was one of the pictures I was going to try to show. And if you remember, that's what this other slide was about. So now I got to go back to the other one. Not that one, but so the encampment here, that's pictured here for you, as you can see very clear. Look at this encampment and how it's set up, with the tabernacle in the center, with the tent around it, and then the tribes sitting beside it. Well, as I made mention, the time frame of what we believe Moses wrote the text in fits perfectly with what we know from Egyptian literature. Moses coming out of Egypt. And this is a picture of Ramses II as he goes all the way up to Kadesh, which is in today Syria, on the border between Syria and Turkey. Kadesh, a major battle there, and he sets up camp. And what is fascinating is the encampment that you have here. The center piece is almost identical to what you find with the tabernacle set up by Moses and his servants. The dimensions that are described, and we have a text from Egypt that describe how they were made and the things that were, how it was put together, are matched perfectly with, guess what, the 14th century down to the 12th century, and they don't match with the Intertestament period. If the writer of, if we say the Pentateuch was written during the Intertestament period, then this man who wrote in the Exodus account had tremendous knowledge of Egyptians thousands of years ago. It just doesn't make sense. And so what I'm saying is that, as I told you what Kenneth Kitchen said, do your homework. If the Bible is true, then the evidence is there. You just got to search. And he said, that requires knowing the languages, of which you need to know about 8. Hebrew, Greek, Ugaritic, Akkadian, hieroglyphics, and the list goes on. And I told you, he's one of the few guys that mastered them all. Mastered them all. Amazing brain. Thank God for men like him that can write like him. And this is out of his work, I told you the book called The Reliability of the Old Testament, and a couple other articles that you can find online if you're interested. And he said, look at this. The dimensions, the setup is basically the same. And this is Ramesses as it goes up into Lebanon. I told you Syria, on the border, just below the border of Turkey. and he fights the famous people called the Hittites. The Hittites. But he sets up camp, and the camp matches perfectly. Now, again, this is a brilliant mind for a guy to come up and say, yeah, I know this relief. That reminds me of what's in the biblical text. And sure enough, he does his homework, looks up there, knows the Egyptian literature, and he says, here's a description of how it was built. Same scenario with the tabernacle. Isn't that amazing? It's not amazing because the Bible is true, right? And if it dates to the 14th century down to the 12th century, it'll match up well. And it does. Anyway, the tabernacle, of course, we want to look at tonight, and the furnishings associated with it. So, there it is. There's a picture of the tabernacle. Remember the tabernacle? We introduced it to you last week. I told you this is a place you can go down to the Negev of Israel, and they have a replica of the tabernacle there for you to go investigate for yourself. So keep in mind the pictures, the tent, all of these ideas that you see here, again, matches well with what you would expect. Moses coming out of Egypt, the people coming out of Egypt. I told you God didn't tell Moses to get sand, melt it down, make me a crystal cathedral. I mean, they would have gone, what? What kind of structure is this? He made something that they could identify with. Why make something out of the unusual? Something that they had no concept about. It doesn't make sense. And so, as you look very carefully then at the tabernacle, and again, we'll go back and forth until we get down to where we can. Here's the tabernacle. The word tabernacle is the word mashkan. All right, mashkan is the word tabernacle. It's translated 14 times as the word tabernacle, but the verb itself occurs 149 times. Why? Because the word means to dwell, or it also can be translated tent. Okay, so again, you're looking at the word tent in the Bible, and if you don't have a good concordance, that's another tool you need. If you don't have a concordance, there's a lot of concordances free online. You can download one to your phone. There's olivetree.com, has Bibles that you can click on the word, and it brings up the Hebrew and Greek word for you with a lexicon. You don't need to know the Hebrew and Greek, but as you look up the word tent, you realize, wow, that's the same word for tabernacle, for the word tabernacle. And then you look at the word dwell. What's this word dwell? Well, look at that. It's the same word for tabernacle. And so it just opens up a wealth of information. Well, it means to dwell, obviously. And so this is unique, as I told you, in relationship to what we have, because now we have a God that's communicating to Israel that I want to be there with you. Out of all of these 129 times uses of the verb, God is the designated subject. God wants to dwell with his people. He wants to tabernacle. We use that a lot of times in a figure of speech, tabernacling with you, dwelling with you. And of course, there's a sunny spot right there. I'm going to have to move over just a tad because it keeps hitting me in the eyeball. It comes right through that screen there. And so I hope that doesn't throw you off there, Jim. I'll give you a plug. That's Jim, in case you don't know. In the video, he's been doing all the videos. We want to thank Jim. Hey! So now it's permanently embedded in the video. Anyway, so God wants to dwell with us. And this is unique. And of course, ultimately, he came in bodily form, did he not? Whoa. I mean, all the other religious systems of the world, all they had was idols, right? Idols. They assumed that if they offered sacrifices and did libations, even performing what? Sacred prostitution, the deity would come down and inhabit the idol. There's nothing like that in the biblical text. God freely came down and took on the form of flesh. I mean, who could have thought of something like that in the ancient world? No one. I mean, that's way beyond anybody's comprehension. And then develop that theme all the way through. I mean, these guys had to be Einsteins if the Bible is not written by God. You know, John saying, we've got to create a Jesus. What do you think, Peter? Yeah, let's create a Jesus. Who can we use? Yeah, because we got it predicted in the Old Testament. Yeah, that's a bad problem, John. Peter, what do you think? Well, let's get this guy Paul. Well, it doesn't make sense, does it? I mean, just all the logistics of this stuff sometimes is just mind-boggling. Who thought of all this stuff? Ask them. Someone says the Bible is nothing but myths and legends. Ask them who thought of these ideas. Doesn't make sense. Anyway. So the description is given quite extensively. Look, chapters 25 through 31, and then repeated almost again in chapters 35 through 40. Is God interested in this piece of this object? Yes. But here comes, as I already mentioned, here's the question. Can a transcendent, an immense God, whom the heavens of heavens cannot contain, can he come down in this fashion? Here's where, have you been good readers, student? Have you been saying, yeah, God dwelt inside? God physically dwelt inside the tabernacle? Have you been saying that? Or have you done your homework? Because in Deuteronomy, it does not speak of the tabernacle as a place where God dwells, but uses the phrase, he causes his name to dwell there. What do you mean, causes his name to dwell there? Well, God can't. I mean, can he really? I mean, of course, we have the unique operation with the incarnation, but this is very clear here. He causes his name, because what does the word name suggest in the Old Testament? So, yeah, but we have. Remember, Manoah asked the angel, says, "What's your name?" I am. Well, he didn't say I am. He said, "I am the angel of the Lord." But the name carries all the significance, the characters and qualities of the individual. It's all wrapped up in the name. And of course, you have the dedicatory prayer of Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 7 and 8, where he dedicates the temple, and he says this is where God is going to place his name forever. And throughout all the Old Testament, about 13, 14 times, God repeatedly says, I'm going to place my name at this place. All the characters, the qualities, the characteristics of who I am. Doesn't say he's going to be there physically, but my name will be there. Interesting. So again, it's a fascinating world. And of course, what the Bible says. So if the tabernacle is the place where God and man meet for worship, it's imperative, therefore, that the institution be spelled out very intricately. Everything is made by explicit command of God, obviously. And you have these long descriptions. Noting, nothing is done on an ad hoc basis. The idea of human architects. It's all the work of God. And so, and that's what I was going to show you the tabernacle. And there it is. So there's the tabernacle. All of it was designed by God, down to every specific. What's going to be there, and where it's going to be placed, how it's going to be made, and the list goes on. So within the descriptive elements, it would take us a whole year to go verse by verse and look at all the descriptive elements that God gave the people of Israel there in these chapters in the book of Exodus. But I guess they're significant, are they not? God never would have included them. He was telling you very clearly that this is my initiative. This is my place. And therefore, there are some very significant things that set it apart. All right? All right, so that's the last slide in that one. So we'll go back to the other one. And then we talked about the gods. And here it says, so what is interesting then about the whole account, again, I'm not an Egyptologist, and so I refer these to experts, which we have a number of good ones. And I would just love, again, make reference to in the video, to have a conference on and have, even invite Kenneth Kitchen, who lives in England, but our Hoffmeyer out of Trinity College, a couple other great scholars, and go through some of the ideas presented in the Old Testament. It's amazing. It's an amazing phenomenon. But anyway, notice very carefully, whoever wrote the account was aware that there such a structure was at home where? In Egypt, in what we call the Bronze Age, which dates from the time of Moses, 1500, all the way down to 1200 BC. The tradition that Israel had a desert tabernacle must go back to this time period, the Bronze Age we call it, 1500 to 1200 BC. At the very least, notice, this suggests the plausibility of the biblical account. The plausibility of the biblical account. Because everything lines up well. So I'm just trying to illustrate again Look at these things that are being described for you in the Old Testament, even the New Testament world. Get some books on the topics. See what God is trying to communicate. Again, you've heard many people say, well, I read the book of Exodus. Then we get through all this tabernacle stuff. Boy, it just lost me. Well, guess what? If you were an Egyptologist or in these fields, you would be jumping, saying, oh, look at that, look at that. Again, homework. The desert tabernacle was commanded to be built by God himself when he spoke to Moses in Mount Sinai, Exodus chapter 25. The structure is described in considerable detail. This description is repeated almost verbatim, again, as I said later on in the other chapters in the book of Exodus. So it's a rectangular structure. It's simple design. It's not very complex, very modest. This is the one I did for Zondervan. If you have the New NIV Study Bible of Zondervan, there's about 35 illustrations. All of them are mine. And based upon, this is done by Derek McKenzie here at our church. You know Derek, the guy with the ponytail, walks across the stage every once in a while. Did you know he's an excellent artist? And I'm using him now for my other book. He made this for me. And it's now in the Zondervan New NIV Study Bible by Zondervan. Anyway, it's a rectangular structure. It's portable. It's roughly about 45 feet long, 15 feet wide, are 30 by 10 cubits. The upright poles, of which the coverings were laid with what? Acacia wood, or shittim wood, covered with gold, set in pairs of silver sockets, and secured by transverse rods. Also, the acacia wood and other parts within the tabernacle were gilded with gold, similar to gilded. So it's not a very elaborate structure, but I want you to notice something. One of the most interesting people, well, here's another picture. I have an illustration, I think. See, make sure. Yes, okay, I got it. Good. Anyway, another important point to note about the tabernacle, with its elaborate construction of what? Gold, silver, bronze, wool, wood, linen, goat's hair, and leather. It's at the same time, ordinary tent. All right? No ordinary tent that you see here. Inside, the space was divided into two parts. The Holy of Holies, all right? The Holy of Holies, Kadosh, as it's called, and for the Ark of the Covenant, which we'll look at, and the holy place where the table and the lampstand stood, all right? This is the same one out in the wilderness. What is interesting is that a lot of people think that it's a condensed version of the Solomonic temple. All right, this is another, idea by some liberal scholars to say that it was written later once they knew about Solomon's temple, because if you cut the dimensions of Solomon's temple in half, it basically matches perfectly with the tabernacle. The only problem is that it's not a tripart temple. Now, this is Solomon's temple. Again, if you know your temples, I do. If you want to come up to Atlanta, I'll be giving a lecture. That was my PhD dissertation, was Canaanite temples, and it'll be in Atlanta on November the 18th. It's not too far away, or not too far physically, and that you might want to come up. There's a lot of. I'll just give you a pitch. There's a lot of lectures. If you're free, you can join. There's 3 societies that meet. One is called the Evangelical Theological Society, which I'll be giving a paper there too. But they meet annually every year, and you're all welcome to come. Scholars from all over the world. This has really grabbed your attention. This year it's in Atlanta. They have different places throughout the United States, but 3 days of solid lectures from 8 o'clock in the morning till 8 o'clock at night, and you can go to any topic you want. Then after that one is the American Schools of Oriental Research, which I'm a member of, and you can go to their lectures. It goes from Thursday through Sunday. And then starting Sunday is another one called the Society of Biblical Literature. It's even bigger than all of them. About 15,000 scholars come from all over the world. Every topic you can imagine is presented there. Besides that, they have the biggest booksellers convention in the world there. And every book that you ever want is on sale, 50% off, 75% off. But something to think about. Look at it, look them up. I would start off with ETS, it's called. Anyway, if you're interested. But you can get their journal too, Evangelical Theological Society. All right, ETS. And you can meet all these guys. All these guys will be there, Hoffmeyer and all the fellows I was telling you about. And you can meet them for yourself. Anyway, is this similar to Solomon's temple? Well, not quite. I mean, it might be a little bit of the dimensions, but they might be a reduction of the dimensions of Solomonic temple. But the design is totally different. And of course, numerous other features. This one is very significant because it's a tripart building. But what is significant about this is that in the New Testament, you're going to have another temple built. This is called in historical nomenclature, this is called First Temple period. All the Old Testament is called First Temple period. And then usually the New Testament is called Second Temple period. All right? Second Temple period with the building of Herod's temple. This is the first temple built by Solomon, in which nothing exists. But notice it's a tripart section. You have 3 parts to it. Those words are used in the Bible. Maybe I made reference last week, but there is no Hebrew word for temple. It's the word house. It's the word Beit, house of God, house of David, all right? But there are 3 terms specifically used in the Bible to describe Solomon's temple. The Debir, which is the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum. Then there's a main hall, it's called a hikal. And then there's a porch, and it's called the Ulam, all right? Those 3 words are used in the Old Testament. A lot of times they're translated temple, but maybe it's not referring to the whole temple, maybe one of the aspects of the temple. Again, knowing the languages helps here. This is a tripart temple, but what is significant about this, as well as the Ark of the Covenant and the surroundings there, is you've noticed that it's called a direct access temple. This is very important because you can enter here, and if the doors were open, you could see all the way back in. And of course, this is very significant when you get to the New Testament because the temple there, built by Herod the Great, it too is a direct access. And remember when Christ died? The veil ripped it so that everybody standing out here could see all the way back in. Showing you very carefully that God does give access to himself. I'm not... Some of the other temples are, just to let you know, are called bent axis. You would enter in this way and you have to turn to the side, to the left, usually to the left, to see the deity. This one wants you, almost invites you to come in. But at the same time, as with the Ark of the Covenant and the surroundings there, notice there are only certain places you can go. Even in the New Testament, remember there was the court of men, court of the women, court of the priests, and then only once a year could the high priest enter into the Holy of Holies, remember, to perform the rituals of sprinkling the blood. This is called graded holiness. It's telling you very carefully that not everybody can have access to me. There's a certain process you have to go through. I want you to step back, he says, and realize who I am. I am transcendent. I am all-powerful. You just can't rush right into me. Set himself apart from the rest of the world, you see. Because in the Greek temples, you could basically go in. And if no one was, you could run right into, to touch some of the idols if you wanted to. But not with God. And this is something similar to in the ancient world as well. But it's called graded holiness. It's kind of an interesting idea. And it fits well with the motif here. Anyway, this one is built out of acacia wood, all right, covered with animal hides. The north and south side of the tent were 20 frames in length, each one about a half a cubit. All right, what's the cubit in the ancient world? Yeah, usually you tip your finger to. So. Short people probably had smaller cubits. I guess, I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, these sides were closed at the west by a wall made of 8 frames, 2 of which were specifically positioned as corners. And this is all described for you in the biblical text. The majority of the portion of the tabernacle measured 30 cubits by 10 cubits. It's based upon the assumption that these frames were erected side by side. And some people believe that, as I have here, that these frames actually overlapped each other so that there were no gaps, so that you couldn't, peek in through the side, although it was covered with animal. It was made, there was a tent of goat's hair made over to cover the outside of it. But it had its own veil inside as well. Well, what is interesting is you got some very interesting pictures of the same idea in Egyptian texts, pictures on tombs and different reliefs from the same time period. This one is Amenhotep the first, who ruled in the 18th dynasty, about the 16th century. And he's showing that he's building his own little cubicle, if you will. Basically, almost the same dimensions as we have in the described for us in the biblical text. Here's another one down at the bottom, just to let you know that we do have him. Remember this guy with the jackal? That's Anubis. He was the god of death. You had to stand before him. In Egyptian theology, remember they put your heart weighted against the feather of truth, and hopefully it balanced out, that it wasn't uneven. Otherwise, the jackal would not allow your soul, to go to the netherworld. Anyway, the jackal was also pictured in Anubis, was pictured in a lot of in mortuary practices, embalming and so on. And of course, now you can ride him, right? Because there's a ride over there at Busch Gardens, and it's called Anubis, right? Anyway, be careful. I don't know where it ends on the very end. It might end you into a coffin. But notice the square box. The same thing here. The tent of purification. The tent of purification. This does not occur after this time period. All right? After the time period of Moses, after 1000 BC, this does not occur again. Wow. And so very, very significant in dating the biblical text. In fact, we actually have one. This is the frame of of guess who? The one that's been preserved very well, that of King Tut. King Tut. Down below, we actually have earlier these are wooden beams that we think were something similar to what was used in the building, but these date about 1,000 years earlier. Well, 2600 BC, yeah, about 1,000 years earlier, 900 years. These are from the great tomb of Khafre and Cheops. Remember the two great pyramids, the biggest pyramids there at Giza, 480 feet tall. His wife was buried next to him, close by. They found her tomb, and inside it had an elaborate frame, a bed frame. It had the wood was still nicely preserved after 4,600 years, and it's in the museum. So that's what you're looking at. These are the wooden frames down here. It's not best, but you can see the wooden poles, basically for the corners of the temple, of the tabernacle. Fits it very well, and it was also covered with hair, a skin covering. Fascinating. Egyptian, not Mesopotamian, not Greek, but Egyptian. Well, here it is. This is King Tutankhamun's a reconstruction of it. And of course, you can go see it if you've been to Egypt. It's in of course, the museum there at Cairo. Anyway, his shrine is shown here, covered with linen cloths, draped over a wooden frame. You see the pole, the end poles. That's what you saw in the previous slide. So it resembles, again, the biblical tabernacle. And this is dominant of what we call the late Bronze Age, from 1500 BC down to 1200 BC, or a little bit later. Tutankhamun, of course, died in the 13th century. And there is his sarcophagus box. This is where they laid his body. But again, the design is the same. You don't see this in Mesopotamia. All of this, of course, is overlaid with gold. With gold. And inside, of course, was his sarcophagus, which was almost pure gold, and then the mask that was on his face, solid gold. Wow. In fact, a couple years ago there in Daytona, they actually had the King Tut display came here to Florida. So anyway, gold-plated wooden boxes overlaid, which you find exactly in the biblical text. All right? Very, very significant. So the tabernacle is quite significant, and it matches well with what we know. Oh, almost out of time here. So let's take a little bit about the objects within the tabernacle. All right, the objects within the tabernacle. You know a lot of them, right? The most significant would be the what? The Ark of the Covenant. But it had a menorah, right? The candelabra. It had the table of showbread. It had an altar and some of these objects. And then outside was a big brazen altar that they could lift and carry. As you can see here, it has the poles and the rings. By the way, all of these as well have the same idea. They could be carried and toted about. And of course these were, because they were not made in the Valley of the Kings where King Tut was buried. They're made in other places and brought to the burial spot of the Valley of the Kings. Well, of course, inside, it was like I said, a very simple design, but it was, again, straight in line. And, of course, they had the main hall separated by a veil where the Ark of the Covenant stood. And you can go to that little museum, if you will, down in the Negev. If you get back to Israel, make sure you get Solomon's Quarries on your itinerary, and you can walk inside there, and there they have a replica. No, these aren't real people, okay? Not real people, but you can walk inside and see what it looked like. And it's not real gold, obviously overlaying the structure there, but it gives you a good idea of what it must have been like. All right. Well, there's the incense altar that was put inside. What we know about it, small altar, but again carried with different rods. This is another one of our reconstructions that's in the NIV Study Bible. And there, if you go to the museum, you can see the same thing, but you can see the poles and the ringlets that were used to carry the incense. Now, this was also true, remember, of the ancient world. All the temples had incense. This was nothing uncommon. But again, the motive and what the effects were is different than what the ancient world and their customs were doing. Similar, obviously. They all had sacrifices, but they weren't trying to feed the god. They weren't trying to entice the god to come to their temple. God wanted them to do this as an object lesson to realize who He is, where He dwells, where He exists, and so forth. What is interesting is the name of God, of course, dwelt there within the tabernacle, and you have a significant reference when David wants to build the temple. God says, you know what? I don't really care for a temple, David. I never asked you to build one. Remember, he collected all the paraphernalia to build the temple and was gung-ho, and God said, no, wait a minute. Who told you I wanted one in the first place? I kind of like it where I am at now. Well, in fact, he challenges David. I don't need a fancy place. I like where I am at now. Look it up. Find the reference where he challenges David about building him a temple, and that he's perfectly content where he's at now. Anyway, this is the altar, and of course the menorah, the branch, which of course gave light. The table of showbread, which, if you remember, David too came into the temple. There at Shiloh, no, it wasn't at Shiloh. Remember, by the time it was at Nob, and then he went into the temple and took some bread from the table there to eat as he was running from King Saul. Menorah matches almost, again, well with what we know from Egyptian text. Solid, gold-plated. Well, the most significant object, obviously, is the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant. I wish we had time. Again, there are pictures in the reliefs that I showed you earlier from the Egyptian encampment. We have a finer detail of I couldn't find it, a finer detail of what's inside the actual encampment of the Pharaoh where he lived. I mean, the dimensions of the tent and the tabernacle all fit very well the dimensions of the king, the Pharaoh, when he was out in battle, what he would take with him, his own private dwelling. No one could come. He had his own little, private space. Because remember, the Pharaoh too in Egyptian culture was deified. Anyway, we do have an inscription that shows something similar of the cherubims inside his surroundings. Kind of fascinating. Anyway, its basic form and nature, again, is described for you in Exodus chapter 25, verses 10 through 22. Again, it's a wooden box, not very big, all right? Roughly about 2.3 feet long by 39 inches wide, all right? So a little over a yard wide. It too was gilded within and without with gold and with a ledge around the upper top. And that's what we created here, a ledge around the upper top. 4 gold rings, obviously, and 4 feet. So that made out of a acacia wood tree. And that was one of the pictures I had. I had a picture of the acacia tree to show you, but it's not coming through. To carry the Ark of the Covenant. Of course, what was kept inside the Ark? The 10 Commandments. And then later on, manna Aaron's budding rod, that's right. That budding rod, if you remember, how long did that budding rod survive? Well, we know it's gone because the king destroyed it. His name was Josiah, the last godly king. The people were worshiping it. And he said, no, took it out and destroyed it. Interesting. So that reminds me, is the Ark of the Covenant around? Some people think it's in Ethiopia. I don't think so. No. No sooner than Solomon died, if you remember, Pharaoh Shishak came up and said what? Went into the temple, took everything out. And poor Rehoboam had to make what? Had to make shields and implements of bronze. All the gold was gone. You don't think Shishak took it when he was inside there? You better believe he did. Interesting. Well, the cherubim. You know they're mentioned 65 times in the Bible? Cherubim? I think cherubim and seraphim are all the same, by the way. If you look very carefully, they have the same function. They both are flaming type of angels and very powerful. Anyway, the function of the ark in relationship to the deity has been much discussed, obviously. And here's other pictures. I mean, we don't know what they... We assume maybe it looks something like this, but we don't know exactly what the cherubim looks like. But we do have an ivory plaque. This is from Mesopotamia. We have cherubims in Egypt. I mean, a pretty common motif, the idea of the cherubim. But what about this box? What was its function? Well, we have something similar. Some people think it's a throne. Some people think it's a footstool. A base box for the invisible throne? For an unseen deity? I mean, did he need this? So, I mean, there's a lot of speculation. I mean, no one has even come down to this, the right answer. What exactly was the purpose of the Ark of the Covenant? Anyway, the best we can come up with, maybe the Ark was all of these, a base box and a footstool. And the wings of the cherub, some have said, made a throne of golden upper element, so that this is where the name of God dwelt. Your guess is as good as anybody else's, okay? Because really we don't have anything else like it. The box, gilded with gold, obviously we do have, as I showed you pictures earlier. But nonetheless, quite interesting. But certainly the Ark of the Covenant is mentioned a couple times in the New Testament. In fact, here again is a nice, you can go on the internet, there's a lot of nice pictures. So I just started grabbing some that I thought were interesting. And it does say that there was some type of smoke rising from inside the tabernacle. So here are the different implements and the Ark of the Covenant in the back. Ark of the Covenant in the back. It's interesting to note in Revelation chapter 11, verse 19, then God's temple in heaven was open, remember John? And the Ark of the Covenant would be seen in the temple. There were flashes of lightning, rumblings, and peals of thunder, an earthquake, and a violent hailstorm. Wow, that's a lot inside that little... Was it all happening at one time in that little place? I don't know. Anyway, the Bible is just certainly, the elements, all of these, of course, were designed to grab Israel's attention. They were designed to keep the focus on their God. It's a sad shame they failed in that responsibility. So the last chapter in the book of Kings as well as Chronicles talks about a king. His name is Jehoiachin. Jehoiachin is in Babylon. But it's interesting to note what he says. He says, and Jehoiachin received double portion from the king of Babylon, from evil Merodach. That was his name. Double portion. And it stops right there. Well, that's great. He received double portion. What does that mean? Well, it's a reminder to the people of Israel, I believe, that God is still alive because they were in captivity. And why were they in captivity? All of these object lessons that God was giving them, they turned their back on it. They accepted Baal, Asherah, all the Canaanite gods. In fact, Jeremiah says, when he's taken down to Egypt, remember he's taken down to Egypt, forced down there, And the people, he writes in his book and he says, I can't believe it. The people still complain. They complain to me and they blame me for it. He says, Jeremiah, it's your fault. Because when we stopped offering raisin cakes or offerings to the Queen of Heaven, all these things started happening to us. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Well, that last passage in the book of Chronicles and Kings talks about Jehoiachin. God is saying, guess what? You know what? You might be off in captivity, still maybe worshiping false gods, but my ultimate plan is still being fulfilled. Why? Because the line of David is still alive. And then for 400 years, God is silent until John the Baptist comes on the scene. And here comes Jesus. Wow. Fascinating story. Who would ever believe that if anybody told you? No one. But there it is, all written for you very clearly. Anyway, all of these things, of course, God is, they're even, of course, written for our example. And a lot of information. I wish we could go into much detail, but just a nice little overview. And trust has been rewarding for you the last 6 weeks. And hopefully look forward to doing it again next year. So, Lord bless you, and you all have a good New Year. Thanks.